Welcome to the Reasonable Christianity Podcast, a weekly podcast where you get to discover the truth claims, teachings, and practices of Christianity. Here's your host, Roland. All right, so we've made it. Finally, we come to the end of our four-part series responding to Penuel the Black Pen. Now, there is a moment in Penuel's video that I want you to hear carefully as we start off this last episode. Because it's one of the most honest things he actually says. Listen to what he says in this particular clip.
I do emphasize that I'm a fan of Jesus Christ and the story of Jesus.
Again, I want us to let that sit for a moment. He is a fan of Jesus and the story of Jesus. He even goes on to say that
it's a beautiful story that should inspire everyone, which is why a lot of the religious believers have no issues with the story of Jesus.
Now, that's not the voice of someone who hates Jesus. That's the voice of someone who genuinely, I think, admires Jesus. Someone who read the story, who finds it moving, would put Jesus on the list of people that he actually respects. And I want to honor that again because Penuel is in good company. I think some of the most thoughtful unbelievers in history have admired Jesus as well. But today, in this final episode of our series, I want to ask the question Penuel's admiration leads us to, I think, logically. And it's the question this whole series has been building toward. And this is the question: who has the authority to define reality? Who has the right to determine truth, morality, and meaning? Who has the authority to tell us who Jesus is? I think this is probably the deepest issue. And until we name it, no other answer will land. And I find this to be such an important topic because even when speaking to other Christians, I often find myself having to bring the conversation back to basics, back to definitions, and ask the question, but which Jesus are we talking about here? Often I would hear Christians say, my God would not do that. Then I would read the Bible and see, but the God they are describing and the God that the Bible portrays are not the same being. And so I think it's important to ask the question, which Jesus are we talking about here? And so let's begin this episode where Penuel begins with his admiration for Jesus, because I really do appreciate Penuel's openness here. Because many critics of Christianity are not hostile to Jesus. They often admire him. Even throughout history, people who have rejected the church have still been moved by the man at the center of Christian thought, Christian reality. For example, Mahatma Gandhi famously said he admired Christ, but not Christians. Even Thomas Jefferson took a pair of scissors to the New Testament and cut out the miracles, but kept the moral teachings because he believed Jesus was a peerless ethical philosopher. People like Leo Tolstoy, the Russian novelist, built his entire late life worldview around the Sermon on the Mount. Albert Schweitzer, the great physician and Nobel laureate, devoted years of his life to studying Jesus academically, even when he could not bring himself to accept the church's claims about Jesus. So Penuel is in a long line. He's not the first thoughtful person to look at the story of Jesus and find it beautiful. Christians and serious unbelievers actually agree about more than people think. We agree Jesus was a real historical figure. We agree his teachings were extraordinary. We agree his life left an imprint on the world that almost no other life has matched. So the question between us is not, do you admire Jesus? The real question is, who is Jesus? And that's where the conversation gets very difficult very quickly. Because admiration is one thing, but identity is another. Here's what I mean. You can admire a man from across a room, but you only kneel when you know who he actually is. So, here's another clip from Penuel, which I think gives us a lot of insight into how Penuel views Jesus. Listen to this.
Now, I need you to understand that the story of Jesus to me could be a fictional story. It doesn't have to be real history.
Now this is interesting. Listen to what Penuel does here. He moves from admiration for Jesus to a quiet downgrade. He says the story of Jesus could be fictional. Maybe Jesus didn't even exist. Maybe he's a character like the figures from mythology, only perhaps more compelling. So inspiring, yes, but not necessarily real. And that's an important move he's making there, and it's a more common move than people realize. It does something specific to Jesus. It keeps the parts that move us, that impact us, things like the kindness and the courage we see in the Gospels, the willingness to confront power, the love for the outcast, but it quietly removes the parts that make demands on us. So the claims about his own identity, the call he makes for us to follow him, the expectation of obedience, and the promise of judgment, even the resurrection. So what's left is what scholars have sometimes called the domesticated Christ, the Jesus we have tamed for modern consumption. You see, here's the thing about modern culture. Modern culture loves the activist Jesus, even the therapist Jesus. They love the revolutionary Jesus or the humanitarian Jesus, even the inspirational Jesus, the motivational Jesus. The Jesus who shows up on our side of every argument. But what modern culture struggles with is the divine Jesus, the exclusive Jesus, the judging Jesus, the sovereign and resurrected Jesus. The Jesus that looks back at you and asks for everything you have. So Albert Schweitzer, the same Schweitzer I mentioned a moment ago, wrote a famous book called The Quest of the Historical Jesus. And in his conclusion, after years of studying every modern attempt to find the real man behind the Gospels, his conclusion was actually devastating. So we tend, as Schweitzer warned, to recreate Jesus according to our own preferences. And that's what the domesticated Jesus is. He is the Jesus we made. But here's the problem with admiring a fictional Jesus. If Jesus is indeed just a story, then his teachings become optional. His morality becomes subjective and his authority disappears completely. So the modern world wants Jesus' inspiration without Jesus' authority. They want his compassion without his commands, and his ethics without his exclusivity. But the trouble is, Jesus never left that option on the table. You can't have the niceties of Christianity without the fierce exclusivity of Christianity. So there's a way of thinking about Jesus that goes like this. They would concede that Jesus was a wise rabbi, perhaps even a great moral teacher, a first century prophet of love and justice. So they would teach us and encourage us to take his teachings and then leave the rest. That sounds almost reasonable. It sounds humble. It sounds like a way of respecting Jesus without committing to the whole package of who Jesus is or who he claimed to be. But the problem is that Jesus didn't just teach. He claimed actual things about himself. And the claims he made are the kind of claims that no mere human teacher should have any business making about himself. Jesus had the audacity to forgive sins. Not just sins committed against him, not just offenses, because we are also commanded to forgive one another, but that's not the same as forgiving sins. That is forgiving an offense. But Jesus forgave sins, as though he had the authority to settle accounts that belonged to God alone. You see, the religious authorities of his day, they understood exactly what he was doing, and they accused him of blasphemy on the spot, because in their world, only God could forgive sins. And yet Jesus was claiming that prerogative for himself. Secondly, he received worship. People fall at his feet, and he didn't stop them. Now compare that to the angels in the book of Revelation or to Peter in the book of Acts, who actually rebuke people for bowing to them. But instead, Jesus accepted what only God can rightly accept. He also claimed authority over the final judgment. He said the destiny of every human soul would, in the end, turn on its response to Him, will be determined by how we responded to Him. That's an amazing claim. Even more amazing, Jesus claimed to have existed before His earthly birth. John 8, before Abraham was, I am. What did the crowd do when he said this? They reached for stones because they knew exactly which name He had just invoked. He had just claimed the divine name I am for Himself. Then, in other passages, He also spoke of His relationship with the Father in terms of equality. He said, the Father and I are one. And whoever has seen me has seen the Father. These guys are not the claims of a wise rabbi. Think about his Jewish background as well. These were the claims of someone who believed he was God in human flesh, or who believed something else that should disqualify him from any list of great moral teachers. If these claims are untrue, then he was anything but a moral teacher. C.S. Lewis puts it sharply. He says, either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he's a madman or something worse. That's in Mere Christianity. So, C.S. Lewis is not running a tidy 3-option logic puzzle here. People sometimes treat his line that way, like he's giving 3 options. No, they miss what he's actually doing. His point is more uncomfortable than that. His point is that Jesus' own claims have closed the door on the easy option. The one option Jesus did not leave open is the one most modern people want to take. Because here's the thing. A man who falsely claims divine authority is not a moral teacher, plain and simple. A man who tells you he is the way, the truth, and the life, but is wrong about that claim, that's not someone you put on the same level or the same shelf as, say, for example, Gandhi or Socrates. He is someone whose central self-understanding was either correct or catastrophically self-deceived, or just wrong. So the historical Jesus is far more disruptive than the modern therapeutic Jesus the culture wants him to be. And nowhere is that disruption sharper than his exclusivity. I think the primary problem most modern people have with Christianity is not the evidence, it's the exclusivity. And this is something I speak to Christians about as well, because we are so tempted to make the gospel, to make Christianity palatable and accessible and acceptable to as many people as possible, that we compromise the core tenets of Christianity, which includes its exclusivity. Because we live in a culture that values inclusion, that values diversity and tolerance and personal authenticity. And let me be clear, those things by themselves are not bad things. There is something genuinely good about a world that has learned to listen across differences. There is something beautiful about a society that refuses to crush its minorities. But that cultural training creates real discomfort the moment any worldview makes an absolute truth claim. And here's the thing about Christianity. It makes an absolute truth claim. And it doesn't apologize for it, even though Christians sometimes do apologize for it. Christianity never does, and it cannot, because of what Jesus says in John 14 verse 6. I am the way, and the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Now notice what that is, and what it's not. This is not a Constantine statement. It's not Rome. It's not a medieval church council saying this. It's not even Western civilization flexing its muscles in a foreign land. This is Jesus, the Jewish carpenter, in the 1st century, before any of those institutions existed, and he's saying this of himself. So you cannot blame the exclusivity of Christianity on the church, or on the Roman Empire. No, the exclusivity of Christianity is found in its founder. And here's the philosophical point I want to help us sit with today for a moment. Every worldview is exclusive. There is no exception. Atheism excludes God. It says on the question of God's existence that the believer is wrong. Islam excludes the divinity of Christ. So it says on the question of Christ's divinity that Christianity is wrong. Hinduism excludes Christian monotheism. So again, on that question about the nature of God, Hindus would say that the picture of God being one is incomplete. Penualism, which is Penuel's own self-authored belief system, exclude whatever does not fit in that belief system. It has to. Otherwise, it would not be a belief system at all. So there is no worldview that holds itself and its rivals as equally true. Ravi Zacharias made the comment, he says that people are equal, ideas are not. So the moment you say all paths lead to the same mountain, you have just made an exclusive claim. You have just said that every religion that denies your statement is wrong. So the question is never, is your worldview exclusive? Every worldview is exclusive. The question is, which one is true? That's the only question that actually matters. And as we move to that answer and how we get to that answer, let me share another clip by Penuel as we kind of delve into these things.
And even the demonization of the term paganism. A big part of paganism is the belief in nature. The sun, the moon, the seasons, the movement of the sun, the belief in springtime and the rebirth and winter and what it represents, of fertility and having children. All of these things, when Christianity became a force, were demonized.
Okay, so in this clip, Penuel raises another objection that comes up often in modern conversations. This is the romanticization of pre-Christian paganism. The sense that Christianity demonized something that was beautiful. That nature worship and the old gods and the seasons and the cycles were closer to the real truth than the imported faith that replaced them. That we see even these kinds of imagery in, for example, Game of Thrones, where you have the new gods, which is this kind of institutional form of religion that have clearly defined deities, clearly defined ways of worshipping those deities, versus the old gods, which is the gods in the woods, the gods of nature, which is a more simplistic, kind of more accessible form of worship. And so I want to speak about this because this is a pervasive idea of contrasting Christianity with the religions that preceded it in the ancient world. Because I don't want to, and I want to do this carefully because I don't want to mock anyone's like family religion or something like that. So Christianity actually agrees with paganism about more than people think again. Christianity agrees that nature is beautiful, that nature reveals something true about God, that nature is not a dead machine but a creation charged with meaning. So the Psalms are full of mountains clapping their hands and rivers singing. The Bible is therefore not embarrassed by the natural world, it actually celebrates it. Listen to what the psalmist says. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaim his handiwork. Psalm 19 verse 1. So that's not an anti-nature theology. That is reverent observation of nature, treating the created world as a window onto its maker. So where Christianity parts ways with paganism is at one specific point. Christianity affirms creation, yes, but it refuses to worship creation. The Apostle Paul makes this argument in Romans chapter 1. He says human beings keep doing the same thing over and over again. They look at the wonder of the natural world, they sense that something deeper stands behind it, and then they make the mistake of bowing to the thing rather than to the one who made it. They exchange the worship of the Creator for the worship of the created. And that's the line. Not nature versus religion, but worshipping nature versus worshipping the one whose handwriting is all over nature. worshipping the creature rather than the creator. And here's what I want to say to anyone who finds paganism intellectually attractive. Every culture eventually treats something as ultimate. It might be nature, it might be the nation, it might be race, it might be the self. It might even be pleasure or even reason, or as we see in our day and age, progress. But something always sits in the seat that ultimate things sit in. The question is never whether you worship. The question is what you worship. And the great claim of Christianity is that nothing in creation is worthy of the weight of your worship, and the weight your worship is going to put on it. Trees cannot save you. The sun cannot forgive you. And the ocean does not know your name. Only the Creator can carry what you were made to give Him. And so that's important for us to realize. Now let's move on to Penuel's belief system. Here's what he says about it once more.
For some of us who believe in some level of consciousness, as it were, I've got my own belief system of Penualism. It's new. It's here. It's me. So people are like, oh, well, why don't you go with the tried and tested older things? And I'm like, I'm unsettled. Something inside me says that cannot be it.
Now, we touched on this in episode 1, and I think it's important for us to go back there because it's where the whole series lands. Penuel describes himself as someone who has moved beyond religion, at least beyond religion as we've commonly been taught and commonly experienced. He has left organized faith behind. That means he's not a Christian, he's not a Muslim, not a Buddhist or a Hindu. He has built his own way, and he calls that Penualism. And I want to take that honestly and seriously, the way I think I've done all the way through the series, because I don't think he's pretending to be on the fence. I think he's telling us honestly where he stands. But I want to ask a question, and I want to ask you without any sneer in my voice, hopefully. What is a religion? This is one of those basic questions, but such an important question. Because here's the thing that most people don't understand about religion. Because we even see some Christians saying that I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. As if those two things are in conflict with one another. But at minimum, a religion is a worldview that answers ultimate questions. That's all it is. Now, religions that might express itself in certain observances, certain beliefs, and certain practices, but that's at minimum what a religion is. It's a worldview that answers ultimate questions. Questions like, where did we come from? Why are we here? What is good? What is evil? What is ultimate? What happens when we die? How should we live? I know that Penuel knows that this is kind of what religion is, and every human being is answering these questions whether they actually realize it or not. The only question is, whose answers are we using? Now, when we look at Penualism, by Penuel's own description, Penualism provides a view of reality, a view of what human beings are, a sense of good and evil, a purpose for living, a source of truth, a way of locating the self in the universe. By that definition, Penualism is a religion. The fact that it has no building or no formal leader, no congregation, no offering plate, does not change what it is. It's still a religion. It performs the same function. It does the same work, similarly to what the LGBTQ movement does. It's a religion. So the modern phrase, like I mentioned earlier, I am spiritual but not religious, almost always means something very specific. It means I prefer self-authored religion to inherited religion. I want the questions, but I want to be the one writing and deciding and defining the answers. So philosopher Charles Taylor wrote a long, careful book called Secular Age, in which he actually traces this development across the modern West. And his argument is that modern people increasingly become their own source of meaning and authority. We don't stop being religious. We only relocate the seat of that religion. The seat used to be God. The seat is now the self. And here's the question that has to be asked, not as an attack, but as a clarification. if Christianity is religion because it answers ultimate questions, why is Penualism not religion? So again, the question isn't whether we worship. The question is what we worship, because we all worship something. And in terms of asking questions, and I know Penuel is someone who likes to ask questions, just like me, it's not so much about the questions, but whose answers are we bowing to? So the question, as I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, is who in the end gets the final word? Who decides, determines, defines reality? Now, let's share another clip by Penuel, because I think this serves to substantiate the claims I just made.
And the Council of Nicaea took away a lot of gospels because there were a lot of people documenting stories and their versions. Why can't we do that today? Why can't we document our revelations, our testimonies, our experiences?
Now that line, guys, is, I think, probably the most important thing he says in the whole video. Because, and this is very important, so please listen carefully, it sounds open-minded. It sounds humble, and I think he means it to be humble. I think he means it from a humble place. And so it sounds like, why are we so locked into ancient texts when human experience continues? But it conceals a profound shift in where authority lives. You see, Christianity begins with a specific direction of movement. God reveals, in the beginning, God. Those are the first lines of the Bible. So God is the initiator. God reveals and humanity receives. Therefore, the Bible is not a record of what people figured out about God. No, it's a record of what God said and did, witnessed and written down by people who were on the ground when it happened. So the direction is clear. It's from above to below. But Penualism, along with many other religious activities and pursuits, like I mentioned, LGBTQ, feminism, these different things, they reverse that direction. They start with our experience. So humanity experiences something, humanity then interprets those experiences, and then humanity authorizes the interpretation of those experiences. Therefore, the self becomes the source, which means your revelation is as valid as mine. Mine is as valid as Penuel's, and Penuel's revelation is as valid as the prophets. We are all just doing the same thing. And this sounds democratic. It sounds liberating even. It sounds like progress. But let's ask the practical questions. How do we, for example, distinguish between revelation and imagination? If my deepest experience and your deepest experience contradict, which one of us is right? Are we both right? And if we are both right, what does the word right even mean anymore? How do we determine or distinguish between truth and preference? If every belief system is equal, and it's equally a revelation, then we haven't multiplied wisdom. We have actually abolished wisdom. Because the moment everything counts as revelation, that means by definition, nothing counts as revelation. So, on that basis, then how do we distinguish between divine authority and self-expression? And this is one of the issues I have with Pentecostalism, which kind of fails to distinguish between what God reveals and what we prefer. People saying, sometimes, in my opinion, very recklessly, God said, God told me this. How do we know that's not just your preferences? How do we know that's not your imagination? How do we know that's not your conscience? How do we know that's not your nurturing side, how you were raised coming through? That's one of the problems I have with Pentecostalism. But in a world of self-authored revelations, the loudest voice wins. The most charismatic personality wins. That's what we see again in the Pentecostal movements. That's what we see in the world as well. The most popular influencer wins. So when that happens, guys, we don't get truth anymore. We only get marketing. But Christianity does something very different. Christianity, historic Christianity, biblical Christianity grounds revelation in the things that can be examined, guys. In public history, in eyewitness testimony. For example, the resurrection claim was made in the lifetime of the people who could have refuted that claim. The witness of the apostles who had nothing earthly to gain by lying and everything to lose by telling the truth. A covenant story that runs through centuries but still hangs together and culminates in a man on a cross outside Jerusalem. Now, obviously, I'm not saying that's perfect proof. It's not. Because there is no perfect proof of anything that matters most in life. But it's a very different category from I felt a thing this morning, therefore reality is shaped this way. Which is sadly what I see many Christians do as well. Now, Penuel asks, why can't we document our revelations today? The Christian answer is, you can write down whatever you like. But writing it down does not make it revelation. It just makes it documentation. The question is not whether you can speak. The question is whether anyone is supposed to listen. Now, most modern objections attack a particular version of Christianity. Corrupted Christianity, politicized Christianity, maybe cultural Christianity, or the Christianity of the wrong people in the wrong centuries, doing the wrong things. And those critiques are often valid, I think. But historic Christianity has never asked you to look at Christians. It always asked you to look at Christ. And the real Jesus is not the domesticated activist of the modern imagination. He is Messiah. The real Jesus is the Son of God. He is Lord and Judge. He is Savior and King. So the man who claimed to be the way and the truth and the life, the man who forgave sins, who received worship and walked out of his own grave on a Sunday morning. The whole faith stands or falls on that claim. And the question I leave you with, Penuel, if you are listening, and the same question I pose to you as the listener, is the one that I think we've been asking throughout, the one that we've been kind of building up to. Who do you say he is? That's the question. That has always been the question. And it's the same question that Jesus himself put on the table 2,000 years ago. Remember Matthew 16? Jesus asked his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Then he said to them, but who do you say that I am? So Simon Peter replied, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus answered him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my ecclesia, my Christian community, my assembly, my congregation, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. That's Matthew 16, verse 13 to 18. Now notice what Jesus does here. He starts with the easy question. Who do people say that I am? Which is public opinion, the general consensus, a kind of cultural reading. The disciples, they obviously have answers. They say you are John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah, maybe a prophet. Then he sharpens the question. But who do you say that I am? You personally. Not what your culture says, not what your tribe says, not what the comment section says, but you personally. Because each of us have to make that kind of choice for ourselves. And on the answer to that question, Jesus says that the whole Christian community will be built, and the gates of hell will not prevail against the people who get that answer right. And that's a question that's been waiting for us and been waiting for every human being who has ever heard the name of Jesus. It is a question Penuel, I think, is wrestling with, even when his words sound like something else. And it's the question every listener is answering, whether they realize it or not. who do you say that he is? You have to make that determination. He's either a lunatic, as the old adage goes, or he's a liar, or he is Lord. Now, before we close, there's one more thing. This series ends today, but the conversation doesn't stop here. This Wednesday, our Patreon partners receive the bonus episode that will crown this whole series. And this episode is called The Unavoidable Christ. And here's the thesis. As I mentioned in this particular episode, every age remakes Jesus in its own image. The progressives remake him, the conservatives remake him, the nationalists remake him, the therapeutic culture remakes him, so we all do it. And the historical Christ keeps refusing to stay inside any of our boxes. So the bonus episode walks through each of those reconstructions. So we're going to lay them next to the biblical text and ask the question the series hopefully has trained us to ask. Which Jesus are we actually following? Now, to our existing Patreon partners, thank you guys. You make this work possible. It means the world to us. And if you've walked with us through these 4 episodes and felt something shift, please, I want to invite you guys to consider partnering with us. Patreon isn't a paywall around truth. It's a training environment where we share bonus episodes, companion PDFs, resources to help you think clearly, love deeply, and defend the faith. So join us at the link in the show notes. With that being said, thank you guys for being patient across these 4 long episodes. And thank you for caring enough about truth to follow an argument all the way to its end. Because as I've done in the previous episodes, and I'll continue to do in the future ones, I'll remind you that the truth really does matter. And so do you.